She acted quickly when she saw the criminal stepfather leaving with her mother. But when she opened his book, she froze. Emily Johnson was trembling with nerves as she held the spare key to her stepfather's office. Her widowed mother had gone out for another romantic dinner with that man who had mysteriously appeared in their lives 6 months ago, right after the first anniversary of her father's passing. That's when she decided she couldn't just stand by and watch those constant outings and Richard Turner's strange behaviors. The man received whispered phone calls in the middle of the night, hid papers when she came home, and always changed the subject when her mother asked about his past. "Mom, you barely know this man," Emily had warned the previous week. "Honey, Richard is a gentleman. Ever since your father left us, I haven't felt so well taken care of," replied Mrs. Susan with that smile Emily hadn't seen in a long time. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Richard always avoided talking about his previous life, never had visits from relatives, and seemed to know too much about their routine. When questioned, he just smiled and changed the subject with a skill that made her even more suspicious. That night, after seeing the two leaving arm in arm for the downtown Denver restaurant, she decided to act. She entered the makeshift office Richard had set up in the guest room and began searching for any evidence of his true intentions. The drawers were locked, but Emily knew every corner of that house. She found the key hidden behind the painting of the Virgin Mary that belonged to her grandmother. Her hand trembled as she opened the first drawer and came across meticulously organized folders. At the back of the last drawer, hidden behind some seemingly normal documents, was a book with a brown cover worn by time. It looked old, with yellowed edges and a smell of old paper that filled her nostrils when she picked it up. Emily looked at the clock. They had only left 20 minutes ago. She had enough time. She opened the book carefully, and her legs almost gave way when she saw what was written on the first page. They weren't criminal notes as she had expected to find. They weren't evil plans or records of other victims. It was a handwritten love letter with careful penmanship and blue ink faded by time. "Susan, my eternal love, even if fate separates us today, I promise I will return to you one day. These are not our last days together. Richard, December 1995. Emily's heart raced. 1995. That was 5 years before she was born. She quickly turned the pages and found more letters, all addressed to her mother, all signed by Richard, all dated from a time when they supposedly didn't know each other. The letters spoke of secret meetings, marriage promises, plans for the future that never came to fruition. One of them mentioned that Susan's father didn't approve of the relationship because Richard was poor and had no prospects. "My God," whispered Emily, feeling the ground disappear beneath her feet. She kept reading, hypnotized by the revelations. Richard wrote about how he was forced to distance himself when Susan started dating another man, about how he found out she had gotten married through mutual friends, about how he followed from afar the birth of her daughter. Her daughter, Emily. In one of the more recent letters, dated just a few months ago, Richard wrote, "Susan, I can finally return. I discovered the truth about how we were separated. Your husband lied about me to win you over. Now that he's gone, I can finally show you who I really am and why I never stopped loving you." Emily let the book fall onto the desk, the noise echoing through the silent office. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. The man she suspected was a criminal was, in fact, her mother's first love, but that raised even more questions. If they loved each other so much, why had her mother never spoken about Richard? Why had he appeared just now? And more importantly, what exactly had her father done to separate them? The sound of the front door opening made her jump in surprise. They had returned early. Emily tried to put everything back in place, but she was so nervous that she dropped some papers. She managed to lock the drawer and run to her room seconds before hearing her mother's voice calling her name. "Emily, dear, are you home?" "I'm here, Mom. I was just studying," she replied, trying to control her voice. Throughout the night, Emily stayed awake, thinking about what she had discovered. The next day, she watched Richard with different eyes during breakfast. He really seemed to care for her mother with genuine affection, but there was something in his eyes, an intensity that bothered her. "Richard, you never talk about your family," commented Emily, testing his reactions. "I don't have much family, dear. I lost my parents early and dedicated myself to work my whole life, he replied, but Emily noticed the tension in his shoulders. What kind of work did you do again? Richard exchanged a quick glance with Mrs. Susan before answering. I worked in business consulting, nothing very interesting. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. But Emily had noticed that he said worked in the past tense. If he was retired, why did he still receive so many work calls? And why did he always step away to take them privately? That afternoon, while her mother was at the beauty salon, Emily decided to confront Richard directly. She found him in the garden, watering the flowers that Mrs. Susan loved so much. Richard, I need to talk to you. Of course, Emily. What is it? He said, but she noticed he already knew something was different. I know about the letters. Richard stopped watering the plants immediately. The watering can slipped from his hand and fell to the ground, spilling water on the grass. What letters? He asked, but his voice had completely changed. The letters you wrote to my mother 30 years ago. I saw the book. Richard sat heavily on the garden bench, as if all the energy had drained from his body at once. You had no right to go through my things, he said, but without aggression, only with deep sadness. And you had no right to lie to my mother about who you really are, Emily retorted. They remained silent for a few minutes. Richard looked at the flowers he had just watered, lost in thought. Sit here beside me, Emily. It's time for you to know the whole truth. Emily hesitated, but curiosity overcame fear. She sat down, keeping her distance. I met your mother when we were 20 years old. She was the most beautiful and intelligent woman I had ever seen. She worked as a secretary in her father's law firm, and I was just a poor boy, making deliveries around the city. Richard paused, as if reliving every moment. We met by chance at a bus stop on a rainy day. She had forgotten her umbrella, and I shared mine with her. It was love at first sight, at least on my part. And on her part, it took a little longer. Richard smiled for the first time since the conversation began. Your grandfather didn't approve of our relationship. I had nothing to offer her. No higher education, no financial prospects. But she insisted she loved me anyway. Emily felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension growing in her chest. What happened then? Your father showed up. He was a lawyer, recently graduated from a traditional Denver family. Everything I wasn't. Richard's voice carried a bitterness he tried to disguise. He started working at Susan's father's law firm and became interested in her immediately. But she always said she loved me and wouldn't marry anyone else. So, how did they end up together? Richard stayed quiet for a long time before continuing. One day, Susan simply stopped contacting me. When I managed to speak with her, she said she'd discovered I was seeing another woman, that I'd lied about my feelings. But was that true? Never. I never betrayed Susan or lied about my feelings. But she'd seen photos, had evidence, or at least thought she did. Emily began to understand where the story was heading. My father fabricated that evidence. It took me years to find out, but yes. He paid a woman to pose for photos with me, edited letters I'd supposedly written to her, created a whole false story. By the time I discovered the truth, Susan was already married and pregnant with you. Emily's heart tightened. Her entire image of her father began to crumble. Why did you never try to tell her the truth? I did. But who would believe a poor young man's word against a respected lawyer? Besides, she was happy, or at least seemed to be. I didn't want to destroy her family because of my suffering. Richard stood up and picked up the watering can again, but his hands trembled slightly. So I left Denver. I spent the last 30 years building a life in New York City, always hoping I could one day return and tell the truth. And now you came back because my father died, Emily concluded. Yes? When I heard he'd passed away, I couldn't stay away any longer. Susan deserved to know the truth, even if it was too late for us. Emily absorbed everything in silence. The story made sense, but there were still gaps that bothered her. The mysterious calls, the strange visits, what are they? Richard hesitated before answering. I still have business in New York City. It's not easy to transfer an entire life from one city to another overnight. There was something in how he averted his gaze that made Emily suspect she wasn't hearing the full story. "Richard, are you really telling me everything?" Before he could answer, they heard the sound of Mrs. Susan's car arriving from the garage. "Promise you won't tell her anything yet. I want to explain everything myself, but at the right time," Richard requested. Emily agreed, but her mind buzzed with doubts. There was something about Richard's story that didn't quite add up, but she couldn't identify what it was. During dinner, she observed the interaction between her mother and Richard. The affection was genuine, that was undeniable. Mrs. Susan smiled more than she had in the entire past year, and Richard treated her as if she were something precious and fragile. "Susan, do you remember how we met?" Richard asked suddenly. Mrs. Susan laughed, a light musical laugh. "Of course I remember. It was at a law school party. You were there with some lawyer friends." Emily nearly choked on the water she was drinking. This version was completely different from what Richard had told her an hour earlier. Richard noticed Emily's confused look and quickly changed the subject. "And you, Emily, how are your university classes going?" "Fine," she replied curtly, still processing the contradiction she'd just witnessed. After dinner, when Richard went to take a shower, Emily took the opportunity to be alone with her mother. "Mom, are you sure you really know Richard well?" "Honey, why that question? Are you still suspicious of him?" "It's just, he seems to be hiding some things about his past." Mrs. Susan sighed and sat beside her daughter on the couch. "Emily, I understand your concern. I know it's strange for me to start a new relationship after being married to your father for so many years, but Richard makes me happy." "But did you two really meet at a college party?" "Why do you ask that?" "Just curious, really." Mrs. Susan thought for a moment. "To be honest, my memory hasn't been the best lately. Sometimes I get confused about details from the past, but I'm sure Richard is a good man." This revelation made Emily even more worried. Was her mother having memory problems? Or was Richard taking advantage of some vulnerability of hers to manipulate her memories? That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the contradictions in Richard's story and her mother's confusion about how they had met. She decided she needed to investigate further. The next morning, while Richard went out to take care of some pending matters, Emily took the opportunity to talk to Mrs. Margaret, the elderly neighbor who had lived next door for over 40 years. "Mrs. Margaret, do you remember when my parents were dating?" "Of course, dear. Why do you ask?" "Did you ever meet any other boyfriends my mother had before my father?" Mrs. Margaret thought for a moment, fiddling with the soil in the plant pots on the porch. "Now that you mention it, yes. There was a young man who came to pick up your mother here a few times. A handsome, polite young man, but your grandfather didn't like him." Emily's heart raced. "Do you remember his name?" "Not really, but I think it was Richard something." "Why? Did something happen?" "No, nothing. Just curious, really." So Richard had told the truth about that. They had really dated decades ago, but why didn't her mother remember him? Emily decided to investigate more deeply. In the afternoon, while her mother was napping, she went back to Richard's office. This time, she looked for other documents that could clarify her doubts. She found folders with bank transfer receipts, all made in the last 6 months. The amounts were considerable, but she couldn't identify where the money was being sent. She also found a business card from a private medical clinic in New York City. On the back, there was a handwritten note. "Dr. Michael, appointment scheduled for September 15th. Emily checked the calendar. Today was September 12th. Richard had scheduled a medical appointment for 3 days from now, but he hadn't mentioned anything about being sick. The more she discovered, the more questions arose. Richard had been honest about the past with her mother, that was confirmed, but there was something about the present that he was hiding. That night, during dinner, Emily decided to test Richard again. "Richard, you never really told us about your work in New York City. What exactly did you do?" "I've said it before, business consulting," he replied, cutting his meat with more force than necessary. "It must have been a well-paying job considering you managed to retire relatively young." Richard stopped chewing and looked directly at Emily. "Why so many questions about my professional past?" "Just curiosity. It's natural to want to know better the person who's dating my mother. Emily, Mrs. Susan intervened, you're being intrusive. No, it's all right, Susan, said Richard, but Emily noticed he was clearly uncomfortable. It's understandable that Emily has questions. Any daughter would. He got up from the table. If you'll excuse me, I'm going to get some air in the garden. After he left, Mrs. Susan turned to her daughter. Emily, what is your problem with Richard? He has been nothing but kind and caring with us. Mum, don't you think it's strange that he showed up in our lives right after my father passed away? That he never talks about family, about friends, about anything from his past? Maybe he has his reasons. Not everyone likes to dwell on the past. Or maybe he has something to hide. Mrs. Susan sighed heavily. My dear, you're looking for a needle in a haystack. Richard makes me happy. Ever since your father passed away, I felt so alone, so lost. Richard appeared like an angel in my life. Mom, do you really not remember meeting him before? Mrs. Susan stayed quiet for a long time. Sometimes I have the feeling I've known him from somewhere, but I can't remember where. You know how it is. It's like having something on the tip of your tongue. And that doesn't make you suspicious? No. Actually, it makes me feel more at ease. It's as if my soul recognizes his. Emily realized she wouldn't be able to convince her mother with words alone. She needed concrete evidence that Richard was hiding something important. The next day she decided to follow Richard when he left for his pending matters. She saw him enter a doctor's office downtown, but it wasn't the clinic whose card she had found. She waited outside until he came out, 2 hours later. Richard looked downcast, walking slowly to the car. Emily hid behind a tree and saw him sitting in the car for several minutes before starting the engine. When he got home, Richard seemed normal again. He greeted Mrs. Susan with an affectionate kiss and asked about her day. How are your matters today? Emily asked innocently. Just boring bureaucratic stuff, he replied, but Emily noticed he avoided looking directly at her. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. That night, Emily had an idea. She decided to search online for information about Richard Turner. Maybe she would find some record of his consulting firm, or anything that could clarify his current situation. After hours of searching, she found some records of a consulting firm in New York City that had been closed about 2 years ago. The owner's name was Richard Turner Smith. The dates matched the period when he said he had retired, but there was something odd about the records. The firm had been closed not due to retirement, but because of financial problems. There were creditor lawsuits and unpaid debts. This didn't make sense. If Richard had lost money with the firm, where were the resources coming from to maintain the lifestyle he displayed? He always paid for expensive dinners, had given flowers and gifts to her mother, and clearly wasn't facing financial difficulties. Emily printed the documents she found and kept them in her room. The next day, she would confront Richard with this evidence. But the next morning, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Susan couldn't get out of bed, complaining of dizziness and nausea. It must be something I ate yesterday, she said weakly. Richard immediately became concerned, insisting on taking her to the doctor. It's not necessary, dear. It will pass, said Mrs. Susan. Susan, please, it's better to make sure it's nothing serious. Emily watched the scene carefully. Richard's concern seemed genuine, but there was something about his insistence that bothered her. Mum, I can take you to the doctor if you prefer, offered Emily. No. If needed, Richard can take me. You both work. I don't want to be a bother. Richard quickly glanced at Emily, and she saw something in his eyes she couldn't identify. Relief? Satisfaction? Of course, Susan. I'll cancel my appointments today and stay with you. Throughout the day, Richard never left Mrs. Susan's side. He prepared teas, brought toast, adjusted pillows, and was extremely attentive. Emily had to admit that he really seemed to care about her mother's well-being. But that evening, when Mrs. Susan finally felt better and went to bed early, Emily took the opportunity to confront Richard with what she had discovered. Richard, we need to talk. About what? About your consulting company that went bankrupt 2 years ago. Richard turned pale. How did you... I looked it up online. I found the records. Your company didn't close because you retired. It went bankrupt. Richard sat down heavily in the living room armchair. Emily, you don't understand the whole situation. Then explain it to me. Where is the money coming from that you're spending on my mother, on the expensive dinners, the gifts, the flowers? It's complicated. Make it simple. Richard stayed quiet for a long time, looking at his own hands. All right. You deserve to know the truth. But promise me you'll let me explain everything before jumping to conclusions? Emily agreed, though her heart was racing with nervousness. When my company went bankrupt, I really did lose almost everything. But there was some money I had been saving for years, ever since I found out about your mother's situation. What situation? Emily, your mother is sick. Emily's world stopped. What do you mean, sick? She's in the early stages of a memory issue. It's not Alzheimer's, but it is something progressive. That's why she doesn't remember me clearly, why she gets confused about details from the past. How do you know this? She never told me, because she doesn't know. She hasn't been officially diagnosed yet, but I've been noticing some symptoms she's been having. Emily felt dizzy. What symptoms? The memory confusions, the trouble remembering recent conversations, the dizzy spells like the one today. I managed to schedule an appointment with a specialist for her, but I'm trying to find a gentle way to suggest she goes. Is that why you were at the doctor's office yesterday? Richard looked at her, surprised. You followed me. Yes. I'm sorry, but I needed to know what you were hiding. I was talking with a neurologist about the best way to approach the situation with your mother. I don't want to scare her, but I also can't let her get worse without treatment. Emily felt torn between relief and worry. And the money you've been spending? For years I've been saving money specifically to take care of Susan if she ever needed it. When I found out she was widowed and I started noticing the first signs of the illness, I decided it was time to use those savings. But why didn't you tell me this from the start? Because you were already suspicious of me. If I came saying your mother was sick, you'd think I was trying to take advantage of her in a moment of vulnerability. The logic made sense, but Emily still felt there were pieces missing from the puzzle. Richard, can you show me these tests or medical documents that make you suspect my mother is sick? Richard hesitated. They're not official tests. They're just observations I've made, compared with research I found online. So you could be wrong? I could. I hope I am wrong. But it's better we make sure. Emily stayed up all night thinking about the conversation. In the morning, she decided she needed to talk directly with her mother about her concerns. Mom, how have you been feeling lately? Regarding your memory, I mean. Mrs. Susan stopped drinking her coffee and looked at her daughter attentively. Why do you ask? Just a normal daughter's concern. Emily, to be honest, I have noticed that sometimes I get confused about some things. Just yesterday I couldn't remember where I had put my wedding ring. Did you find it? Richard helped me search and we found it in the kitchen, inside the sugar jar. I have no idea how it ended up there. Emily felt a chill in her stomach. This was indeed a worrying symptom. Mom, I think it would be good for you to see a doctor. Do you think there's something wrong with me? I don't know, but it's better to be sure. Mrs. Susan stayed quiet for a few minutes. Richard has been suggesting that too. Maybe you're both right. That afternoon, Richard scheduled an appointment with a neurologist for the following week. Emily insisted on accompanying them. During the days leading up to the appointment, Emily watched her mother more closely and really noticed small lapses she had ignored before. Mrs. Susan forgot where she had put her keys, repeated questions she had asked just minutes earlier, and sometimes seemed confused about what day of the week it was. On the day of the appointment, the doctor conducted a series of cognitive tests with Mrs. Susan. The results were inconclusive, but he recommended some more specific exams. Is there a possibility of some memory problem? Asked Emily directly. It's too early for a definitive diagnosis, but there are some indicators that suggest mild cognitive impairment. It's not necessarily Alzheimer's, but it requires monitoring. Mrs. Susan left the office, visibly shaken. I really am getting senile, she said in the car with tears in her eyes. "Don't say that, Mom," comforted Emily. "We'll do the tests and see exactly what's going on." Richard held Mrs. Susan's hand affectionately. "Susan, no matter what we find out, I'll be here to take care of you." That night, Emily felt guilty for having been so suspicious of Richard. Maybe he really was just a man in love trying to protect and care for the woman he loved. But a few days later, something happened that again aroused her suspicions. Emily came home early from university and heard an argument coming from Richard's office. He was speaking on the phone in an agitated voice. "No, you don't understand. I can't pay that now. I need more time." Emily quietly approached the door. "The situation has changed. I have other priorities now. I can no longer transfer that amount monthly." There was a long pause. "No, I won't let her find out. But I also won't sacrifice her treatment because of your threats." Emily felt her blood run cold. Threats? Was Richard being blackmailed by someone? "Look, I've already paid much more than I owed. If you want to continue with this, you'll have to find another way. Now, I have a family to protect." The conversation ended abruptly. Emily ran to the kitchen and pretended to be preparing a snack when Richard came out of the office. "Hi, Emily. I didn't hear you come in." "I just got here. Is everything okay with you?" "You look stressed. Just some bureaucratic retirement issues. Nothing important." But Emily knew she had heard something much more serious than bureaucratic issues. Richard was being blackmailed by someone and had decided to prioritize the expenses for his mother instead of continuing to pay the blackmailer. This meant that he really cared about Mrs. Susan, but it also meant that there were secrets in his past that could put the whole family at risk. Emily decided that she needed to find out more about what Richard was hiding, no longer out of suspicion about his intentions with her mother, but out of concern for both of their safety. That same night, while Richard was helping Mrs. Susan with her sleep medication, Emily went back to his office. This time, she specifically looked for evidence of what she had heard in the phone conversation. In the bank statements she saw regular monthly transfers to an account she couldn't identify. The amounts were considerable and had been paid for over 2 years. She also found some printed emails from an account that Richard kept separate. The messages were vague but clearly threatening. "Richard, you know very well what happened in 2018. If you don't want certain information to come out, keep fulfilling our agreement. Your past hasn't been forgotten. The families involved are still suffering the consequences. The least you can do is keep contributing to ease the damages." Emily felt her heart race. What exactly had Richard done in 2018? Which families were suffering consequences? And why had he been paying some kind of compensation for years? She took pictures of the emails with her phone and put everything back where she found it. The next morning, as soon as Richard left, she would look further into what might have happened in 2018 involving his company. But before she could leave the office, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Richard was coming back. Emily hid behind the curtain and saw him enter the office to grab something he had forgotten. When he left again, she waited a few minutes before returning to her room. Her heart was still pounding from the adrenaline of almost being discovered. The next day, while at the university, Emily used the library computers to research Richard Turner and events from 2018. After hours of searching, she found a news story that chilled her. Consulting firm involved in tax evasion scandal results in bankruptcy of 3 family businesses. The article was from December 2018 and mentioned that a consulting firm in New York City had given improper tax advice that led to heavy fines and the bankruptcy of 3 family businesses. The consulting firm was owned by Richard Turner Smith. The news went on to explain that the families lost everything and that there was an ongoing lawsuit against the consulting firm. The case was closed with an out-of-court settlement in which Richard agreed to pay compensation to the affected families. Now everything was starting to make sense. Richard wasn't being blackmailed. He was fulfilling a legal agreement to compensate the families who had lost everything because of his poor consulting. And now, to take care of Mrs. Susan, he had decided to stop making those payments. This meant that Richard truly cared about his mother enough to risk legal trouble to ensure she received the necessary treatment. But it also meant that he had financially destroyed 3 families through his professional negligence. Emily felt completely confused. Was Richard a good man trying to care for the woman he loved, or was he someone irresponsible who had ruined the lives of innocent people? When she got home, she found her mother and Richard in the kitchen, preparing dinner together. They were laughing at something Richard had said, and Mrs. Susan seemed happier and more animated than she had been in months. "Honey, you're just in time," said Mrs. Susan. "Richard was telling me stories from when he worked with family businesses, very interesting things about how some families build their businesses." Emily almost choked. Was Richard really telling his mother about the time he had destroyed family businesses? "What kind of stories?" she asked, trying to keep her voice normal. "Oh, Richard was explaining how important it is to have competent consulting when you have a family business. He said he's seen many families lose everything because of poor professional guidance." Emily looked directly at Richard, who held her gaze without blinking. "It really is important to have competent professionals," she said, loading the words with meaning. "Exactly," replied Richard. "I myself made mistakes in the past that cost some families dearly. It's something I carry with me to this day." Mrs. Susan looked at Richard with tenderness. "Dear, we all make mistakes. What's important is to learn from them." "Some mistakes are more serious than others, Mom," commented Emily. Richard served the plate to Mrs. Susan before responding. "Emily is right. There are mistakes that only affect ourselves, and there are mistakes that destroy other people's lives. Those are unforgivable." The dinner continued in a tense atmosphere, at least on Emily's part. Mrs. Susan seemed oblivious to the tension and kept talking normally about everyday matters. After dinner, Richard asked to speak with Emily privately. "You found out about 2018, didn't you?" Emily saw no point in denying it. "I did." "And what do you think about it?" "I think you destroyed 3 families' lives with your incompetence." Richard absorbed the criticism without defending himself. "You're right. It was the worst time of my life. I truly believed I was giving good advice, but I was wrong. Completely wrong. And now you stopped paying the compensations to use the money for my mother." "I didn't stop paying. I reduced the amounts and I'm negotiating a new schedule. The families understood the situation when I explained I needed to care for someone who's ill." Emily was surprised by the answer. They agreed. 2 of the 3 families agreed. The 3rd one is being harder to negotiate with, but we'll reach an agreement. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know who your mother is involved with. I made serious mistakes in the past, mistakes that affected innocent people. But I learned from those mistakes, and now I'm trying to be better." Richard sat on the living room sofa and gestured for Emily to sit as well. "When my company went bankrupt because of the lawsuits, I had nothing left. I lost my house, my assets, everything went to pay the compensations. I was deeply depressed for months." Emily listened in silence. "That's when I decided that if I ever got a second chance in life, I would do things differently. I wouldn't be greedy anymore. I wouldn't cut costs at the expense of service quality. I wouldn't put profit above responsibility. And my mother represents that second chance. Your mother represents much more than that. She represents the love of my life, the person I should have fought for 30 years ago. If I had had the courage to stand up to your grandfather and your father back then, maybe none of this would have happened." "What do you mean?" "If I hadn't given up on Susan, I wouldn't have spent 30 years building a company just to prove I was worthy of her. I wouldn't have cut costs to profit faster. I wouldn't have given irresponsible advice trying to close deals quickly." Richard paused, looking at his own hands. "All my professional success was motivated by the desire to one day return to Susan as a prosperous man. The irony of fate is that it was exactly this ambition that made me unworthy of her." Emily began to understand the complexity of the situation. "But now you're here. Now I'm here because I have nothing left to lose. I lost money, reputation, pride. The only thing I have left is the genuine love I've always felt for your mother. And if she finds out about your past, then she'll decide if she still wants to be with me knowing everything. But I won't lie or hide anything anymore. I've lied too much in my life, dear listener. If you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Emily remained silent for a long time, processing everything she had heard. "Richard, are you going to tell everything to my mother?" "I am. But I want to wait until we have her test results. If she really is sick, I don't want to add more stress to the situation. And if she decides to end the relationship, then I'll respect her decision. But at least she will know the whole truth before deciding." That night, Emily had trouble sleeping again. On one hand, Richard had been honest about his mistakes and seemed genuinely remorseful. On the other hand, he had caused real suffering to innocent families. The next day, she decided to conduct her own investigation into the families affected by Richard's company. She wanted to better understand the actual impact of his actions before forming a definitive opinion. She managed to contact one of the families through social media. The daughter of one of the businessmen who went bankrupt agreed to speak with her on the phone. "My father lost the business he had built over 40 years, the woman shared. "We were completely devastated financially." "And how are you doing now?" "It was tough, but we managed to recover little by little. Dad started a smaller, more modest business. In fact, he said it was an important lesson about not putting all your eggs in one basket." "Do you keep in touch with Richard?" "He writes to us periodically to check on how we're doing. He always offers to help if we need anything. Honestly, we believe he didn't have bad intentions. It was incompetence, not malice." "And the compensations he pays?" "He has strictly adhered to the agreement. Recently, he asked to reduce the amounts a bit because he needs to care for a sick family member. We agreed because he has always been very fair with us." This conversation gave Emily a different perspective on Richard. He seemed to have truly taken responsibility for his mistakes and was trying to make amends as best he could. When she got home, she found her mother visibly agitated. "Honey, come here quickly." "What happened, Mom?" "The test results came in." Emily felt her stomach tighten. Richard was sitting at the kitchen table with the papers in his hand. "So?" asked Emily, fearing the answer. "It's not what we thought," said Richard with a sad smile. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Susan took the results from Richard's hands. "The tests showed that I have a vitamin deficiency that was affecting my memory and concentration. It's not dementia or Alzheimer's." Emily felt a wave of relief. That's great. It's treatable with supplements and dietary changes," explained Richard. "The doctor said that in a few months she should be feeling much better." So the memory confusion was caused by the nutritional deficiency. Apparently it's more common than you'd think, especially in people who have gone through periods of intense stress like grief. Mrs. Susan hugged Emily and then Richard. "You two were so worried about me. Thank you for insisting that I seek medical help." That night, Richard suggested they celebrate the good news with a special dinner. But while preparing the meal, he pulled Emily aside. "Now that we know your mother is well, I need to tell her the truth about my past. Are you sure it's necessary?" "I am. She deserves to know who she's involved with. What if it changes how she sees you? Then it will be her decision, but I can't keep hiding who I really am anymore." Over the weekend, Richard organized a special lunch in the backyard. After the meal, when everyone was relaxed and happy, he took a deep breath and began to speak. "Susan, Emily, I need to tell you some things about my past that you don't know yet." Mrs. Susan immediately became worried. "Richard, what is it? You're scaring me." "It's nothing that will put you in danger, but they are important things I should have told you before." Emily held her mother's hand, preparing to support her if the news was hard to accept. Richard told the whole story, about how he and Mrs. Susan had dated in their youth, about how Emily's father had fabricated evidence to separate them, about how he had spent 30 years building a company to try to be worthy of her, and about how his professional mistakes had destroyed the lives of innocent families. Mrs. Susan listened to everything in silence, sometimes touching her forehead as if trying to recover lost memories. When Richard finished speaking, they all remained silent for several minutes. "I remember you," Mrs. Susan finally said with tears in her eyes. "Now that you've told everything I remember, you were the poor boy my father didn't approve of." "You really remember?" I remember that I truly loved you. I remember my heart broke when I thought you had betrayed me." Mrs. Susan stood up and walked to the rose bush that Richard had planted in the garden weeks ago. "And I also understand why you feel guilty about the families who lost their businesses." Richard approached her cautiously. "Susan, I'm no longer the poor boy you knew, but I'm also not the successful businessman I wanted to be when I came back to you. I'm just a middle-aged man who made serious mistakes and is trying to be better." Mrs. Susan turned to look into his eyes. "Richard, do you think I care about money or status? Do you think I care more about how many zeros you have in your bank account than the size of your heart?" Richard was speechless. The man who planted this rose bush for me, who took care of me when I was confused and scared, who insisted I seek medical help when even I didn't think it was necessary, that man is worth far more than any successful businessman. Emily watched the scene, moved. "But Susan, I destroyed the lives of innocent people. And you took responsibility for it. You're paying for your mistakes and trying to make up for the damage. That's more than many men would do." Mrs. Susan took Richard's hands. "Dear, we all make mistakes. The difference lies in how we handle those mistakes after they happen. And can you forgive my mistakes? Richard, I forgave my late husband for lying about you 30 years ago. Do you think I can't forgive you for trying to conquer the world to deserve my love?" Richard hugged Mrs. Susan and cried like a child. 30 years of guilt, regret, and longing finally found peace. Emily approached and hugged them both. "You have my blessing," she said. "But I want you to promise one thing, Richard. Anything. Never hide anything from us again. We're a family now, and families face problems together." "I promise." A few months later, Mrs. Susan had fully recovered from her nutritional deficiency. Her memory was sharp again, and she had resumed all the activities she enjoyed doing. Richard had managed to renegotiate all the agreements with the families affected by his former company. 2 of them had agreed to receive smaller amounts over a longer period, and the third had agreed to close the deal in exchange for Richard helping them rebuild the business as a free consultant. Emily, who had completed her postgraduate degree in psychology, decided to specialize in family therapy. The experience with her own family had shown how secrets and misunderstandings can destroy relationships, but also how honesty and forgiveness can rebuild them. One Sunday afternoon, the 3 were in the garden when Richard brought out a small velvet box. "Susan, I know I can't give back the 30 years we lost, but I can promise to be by your side for the next 30 years we have left." Mrs. Susan laughed through her tears. "Richard, are you sure you want to marry a stubborn old lady who'll give you trouble for the next 30 years? "Susan, I spent 30 years dreaming of this trouble." Emily dried her own tears and applauded when her mother said yes. The wedding was simple, held right in their backyard with only a few close friends and Mrs. Margaret, the neighbor who had witnessed their first love decades ago. During the ceremony, Richard read the vows he had written especially for the occasion. "Susan, I promise never to let fear or pride keep me away from you again. I promise that if I make mistakes, and I probably will, I'll take responsibility for them, and we'll do whatever it takes to fix them together. I promise to love you not just on the good days, but especially on the difficult ones." Mrs. Susan replied, "Richard, I promise to forgive you for taking 30 years to come back. I promise to support you while you continue paying for past mistakes, because I know that makes you a better man. And I promise to love you for the rest of our days, whether they be many or few." After the ceremony, while tidying up the house, Emily found Richard storing the old letter book on a new shelf. "Are you going to keep it forever?" she asked. "No," Richard answered. "I'm going to start a new book, a book of new memories, so when we get old and forgetful, we can remember all the happy moments we built together." Richard showed Emily a new notebook with a brown leather cover similar to the old book. "On the first page, I'll write about the day a suspicious young woman barged into my office and changed our lives forever." "I changed your lives?" "Emily, if you hadn't found those letters, I might have spent years stalling your mother trying to find the courage to tell the truth. You forced us to be honest with each other. And if I hadn't found them, would you never have told?" Richard thought for a moment. "I would have told eventually, But maybe it would have been too late. Maybe your mother would have become too attached to the idealized version of me to accept the reality. And what did you learn from all this? I learned that true love isn't about being perfect for the other person. It's about being truthful, even when the truth is uncomfortable. That evening, the new family gathered in the kitchen for their first dinner as officially married. Mrs. Susan had prepared Richard's favorite dish, and he had bought flowers to decorate the table. "Emily," said Mrs. Susan, "thank you for being suspicious of Richard." "What do you mean, Mom?" "If you hadn't investigated, we might never have discovered the whole truth, and our happiness would have been built on lies and secrets." Richard agreed. "Your daughter taught us that a real family isn't afraid to question, to investigate, to demand honesty from each other. You're not mad at me for barging into your office and snooping through your things?" "We're proud," said Mrs. Susan. "You protected me even when it meant uncovering difficult truths." Richard raised his juice glass for a toast to Emily, who taught us that sometimes the greatest proof of love isn't blind trust, but demanding that the people we love be worthy of our trust. To my mother, who taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting people's mistakes, but choosing to love them despite their mistakes, said Emily, raising her glass. And to Susan, who taught me that it's never too late to come home, concluded Richard. After dinner, the three of them sat on the porch to watch the sunset. Mrs. Susan was flipping through the old letter book Richard had written decades ago. "You know, Richard, reading these letters now, I realize you were always too romantic for your own good." "What do you mean?" "You romanticized our separation, romanticized your professional success, even romanticized your mistakes. Maybe if you were less romantic, you would have handled reality better." Richard laughed. "You might be right, but if I weren't a romantic, I wouldn't have kept these letters for 30 years hoping for a second chance." "Touché," said Mrs. Susan. Emily watched the interaction between them and realized how they complemented each other. Her mother was practical and down to earth. Richard was a dreamer and idealist. Together they created a balance that neither had alone. "Do you know what impresses me most about this whole story?" said Emily. "What?" they both asked. "It's that my father, trying to destroy your relationship with lies, ended up creating an even stronger love story. If you had stayed together back then, maybe you wouldn't appreciate each other. But having to wait 30 years and overcome so many obstacles made you realize how much you truly love each other." Mrs. Susan took Richard's hand. "Emily is right. If we had married when we were young, I might have become a critical wife, always demanding that you be more ambitious, and you might have become a resentful husband, always trying to prove your worth. And now? Now I know you're worth more than any bank account, and you know my love doesn't depend on your professional success," said Mrs. Susan. Richard kissed her hand delicately. "Sometimes the longest paths lead to the surest destinations." When night fell, Emily withdrew to her room and left the couple enjoying their first moments as official husband and wife. In the silence of her room, she reflected on everything that had happened in the past few months. It had started with her suspecting that Richard was a criminal, trying to take advantage of her vulnerable mother. She discovered he was actually a man with a complicated past, but with genuine intentions and true love. The experience had taught her some important lessons about judgment, forgiveness, and family. People aren't always who they appear to be on the surface, but that doesn't mean their intentions are necessarily malicious. Sometimes people hide secrets not to deceive, but to protect. She had also learned that true love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to stand by someone, even knowing their flaws and mistakes. Her mother had chosen to love Richard, knowing he had destroyed family businesses. Richard had chosen to take responsibility for his mistakes, to be worthy of that love. And she had learned that being family means more than sharing DNA. It means being willing to question, to forgive, to support, and to grow together. Months passed and the new family's routine settled naturally. Richard had gotten a job as a consultant at a small firm, this time being extremely careful and conservative in his advice. He preferred to earn less and sleep with a clear conscience. Mrs. Susan had returned to her activities at the church and the library reading group. Her energy and joy had fully returned, and she was even considering taking a painting class. She had always wanted to try. Emily had been accepted into a master's program in family therapy and was loving her studies. Her personal experiences gave depth and authenticity to her academic interest. One day, Richard came home with important news. "Susan, Emily, I have something to tell you." The two looked at each other with concern. After everything they had been through, any important news made them nervous. "It's good news," Richard reassured them quickly. "I've finalized all the compensation agreements with the families affected by my former company." "What do you mean finalized?" asked Emily. "The last family agreed to settle our dispute. I managed to help them rebuild their business more solidly, and now they're even making more money than before the bankruptcy." Mrs. Susan hugged her husband. "How do you feel?" "Free. For the first time in years, I feel like I can look to the future without carrying the weight of the past." "And financially, how are we?" Emily asked practically. Richard laughed. "Well, we're not rich, but we're not in poverty either. I have enough for us to live comfortably as long as we don't have extravagant ambitions." "Darling," said Mrs. Susan, "after everything we've been through, the only ambition I have is to grow old by your side, planting flowers in this garden. And my only ambition is to deserve that privilege every day." That evening, the three of them were watching a movie in the living room when the phone rang. It was one of the families Richard had helped. "Richard, this is David from the company you helped rebuild. I have a proposal for you." "Hi, David. What proposal?" "We and the other two families were talking. We want to hire you as our permanent consultant. But we don't want someone who tells us how to get rich quick. We want someone who teaches us how to build solid and ethical businesses." Richard was surprised. "You want to hire me? After everything that happened?" "Especially because of what happened. You learned the hardest lessons in the most expensive way possible. Now you can teach us to avoid the same mistakes." Richard looked at Mrs. Susan and Emily, who were listening to the conversation. "David, can I think about it a bit and give you an answer?" "Of course, but know that we trust you more now than we would trust any consultant who has never made a mistake." When Richard hung up the phone, he stared at the device for a long time. "What do you think, Susan?" "I think it's an opportunity to turn your past mistakes into something positive." "Emily?" "I think it would be a way to help other families avoid going through what these families went through. And it would be a way for you to use your experience for good." Richard thought for a few minutes. "Do you know what impresses me most about this proposal?" "What?" the two asked. "It's that they don't want to hire me despite my mistakes. They want to hire me because of my mistakes, because of what I learned by going through them." "Does that change anything for you?" asked Emily. "It changes everything. It means I can turn the worst time of my life into the foundation for the best phase of my career." The next day, Richard called David and accepted the proposal. But with a few conditions. He would only work part-time, to have time to take care of his family. He would never promise miraculous results, and he would always be transparent about the risks of any strategy. The three families agreed to all the conditions. In fact, they said that was exactly the kind of honesty and caution they were looking for in a consultant. Richard started working with them the following week. For the first time in years, he felt he was using his professional skills to help people instead of just getting rich. One afternoon, while Richard was working in the makeshift home office, Emily knocked on the door. "Can I interrupt?" "Of course, come in." I wanted to apologize. Richard stopped typing and looked at her in surprise. "Apologize for what?" "For having distrusted you so much at the beginning, for breaking into your office, snooping through your things, investigating your past without your permission." Richard laughed. "Emily, you don't need to apologize for protecting your mother." "But I could have talked to you directly from the start, instead of acting like a paranoid detective." Richard got up from his chair and went to the bookshelf where he kept the book of old letters next to the new memoir he was writing. "Can I tell you a secret?" "Of course." "When I found out you had discovered my letters, I was relieved." "Relieved?" "Yes, because it meant I wouldn't have to find the courage to tell the truth. You forced me to be honest. You gave me an excuse to stop hiding who I really was." Richard picked up the new book and showed some pages to Emily. "Look what I wrote about you in our family memory book." Emily read aloud. "Emily is the guardian of our family. She questions, investigates, suspects, and protects. Thanks to her, our family is built on truths, not illusions. She keeps us honest with each other." Richard: "This is how I see you, Emily. Not as someone who invaded my privacy, but as someone who protected our family's integrity." "But what if I had discovered something truly terrible? What if you really were a criminal?" "Then you would have protected your mother from a criminal. Either way, you would have done the right thing." Emily hugged Richard. "Thank you for accepting me as your daughter, even though I'm so suspicious. Thank you for accepting me as your stepfather, even though I have such a complicated past." That night during dinner, Richard made an announcement. "Susan, Emily, I want to propose something to you." "What is it?" asked Mrs. Susan. "I want us to take a trip." "Where to?" "To New York City. I want you to meet the families I helped rebuild their businesses. I want you to see what we built together from the wreckage I caused." Mrs. Susan was excited about the idea. "It would be wonderful to meet these people." "Emily," asked Richard, "I think it would be important for our family to know the whole story, not just the part that happened here in Denver." A week later, the three of them traveled to New York City. Richard had arranged meetings with the three families that were affected by his former company. The first family welcomed them at their new company, which was now smaller, but much more financially solid. The patriarch, Mr. David, told Mrs. Susan and Emily how Richard had helped them not only financially but also emotionally. "When we lost everything, we were so angry with him, but when he came back to take responsibility and help us start over, we realized that the anger was consuming us more than it was him." "And now?" asked Mrs. Susan. "Now we are grateful, not for the loss we suffered, but for the opportunity to rebuild something better and more solid." The second family had a similar story. They had used the bankruptcy experience to completely rethink their business model and were now more prosperous and, more importantly, happier than before. The third family was the most inspiring to meet. They had transformed the experience into a consulting service to help other family businesses avoid the mistakes they themselves had made. "Richard taught us that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what truly matters," explained the family matriarch. During the trip back to Denver, the three of them were quiet for a long time, each processing what they had seen and heard. "Richard," said Mrs. Susan finally, "I'm proud of you." "Why?" "For turning your biggest mistakes into your greatest virtues." "Emily, what did you think of the trip?" "I learned that sometimes people need to be broken to discover who they really are, and that the true measure of a man is not how many times he falls, but how many times he gets up and helps others get up too." When they arrived home, they found a surprise waiting for them. Mrs. Margaret, the neighbor, had taken care of their garden in their absence and had planted a new rose bush next to the one Richard had planted months earlier. "I thought a rose bush needed company," she explained with a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Margaret," said Mrs. Susan, hugging her neighbor. "Actually, I should be the one thanking you." "Why?" "For reminding me that it's never too late for true love. You gave me hope that I can still find happiness at my age." That evening, the family gathered in the garden to admire the two rose bushes. Richard was writing in the new memory book, Mrs. Susan was watering the plants, and Emily was studying for a test. "Do you know what I'm writing now in our book?" asked Richard. "What?" both asked. "Sometimes the best families aren't the ones that are born ready, but the ones that are built through honesty, forgiveness, and second chances." "That's a beautiful sentence," said Mrs. Susan. "But it's not finished yet," continued Richard. "And sometimes the most important book isn't the one that tells what we were, but the one that records what we are becoming." "Is it finished now?" asked Emily. "It's finished now." Mrs. Susan approached and read over Richard's shoulder what he was writing. "Can I add something?" "Of course." Mrs. Susan took the pen and wrote in the book, "And sometimes the greatest proof of love isn't never questioning, but questioning because you care." "Is this one for me?" asked Emily. "It's for you, dear. Thank you for questioning, for being suspicious, for forcing us to be honest with each other. Richard closed the book and placed it on the garden table. "Do you know this book will stay here forever?" "What do you mean?" asked Emily. "It will stay here in the garden on this table, so anyone in the family can write in it whenever they want. Our joys, our worries, our memories, everything that's important to our family will be recorded here." "And if it rains?" asked Mrs. Susan practically. Richard laughed and showed that he had placed the book inside a transparent acrylic box, protected from the rain, but accessible for writing. "I thought of everything." "Of course you did," said Emily, laughing. "You're too romantic to let a family memory book be destroyed by rain." The three laughed together, and Richard realized that for the first time in a long time, laughing wasn't loaded with guilt or melancholy. It was a light, genuine laugh from people who had found peace with each other. When night fell and they prepared to go inside, Richard took one last look at the garden they had cultivated together. The rose bushes were blooming, the grass was green and well kept, and the table with the memory book was at the center of everything, like an altar dedicated to family honesty. "Richard," called Mrs. Susan from the door. "Are you coming?" "I'm coming," he replied. But before going inside, Richard opened the box and wrote one last entry in the book that day. "Today I understood that home isn't a place where you hide who you are. Home is a place where you can be exactly who you are, with all your flaws and virtues, and still be loved. Today I came home." When he entered the house, he found Mrs. Susan and Emily preparing tea in the kitchen. The two were talking about weekend plans, about Emily's classes, about Richard's new project with the family businesses. It was an ordinary, everyday conversation about simple things in life. But for Richard, who had spent years feeling disconnected from any family, it was the most precious conversation in the world. "Richard, would you like some tea?" asked Mrs. Susan. "Yes, thank you. Emily was telling me about a lecture she's going to give at the university about family therapy." "And what will the topic be?" asked Richard, sitting at the kitchen table. "When secrets protect and when secrets destroy," replied Emily. "Based on our experience, based on what I learned observing our family. Just as the secrets you kept initially were to protect your mother, but hiding those secrets was causing more harm than good." Richard thought about this. "And what's your conclusion?" "That secrets are acceptable when they temporarily protect someone you love, but become destructive when prolonged beyond what's necessary." Mrs. Susan joined the conversation. "How so?" "Richard hid the truth about you two having dated because he wanted to make sure his mother was in good health before adding more emotional complexity to her life. That was protection. But if he had never told the truth, it would have become manipulation." "That's an interesting distinction," said Richard. "I also learned that sometimes questioning someone you love isn't a lack of trust, it's an excess of care. I questioned you because I cared about my mother's well-being. And I hid the truth because I cared about both of your well-being," Richard added. Mrs. Susan held both their hands. "And I forgave both of you because I understood that both the questioning and the secret came from love." They finished their tea in a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about how they had gotten there. When they were getting ready to go to sleep, Emily stopped at her parents' bedroom door. "Can I ask a question?" "Of course," said Mrs. Susan. "Are you truly happy? After everything you've been through, all the obstacles, do you feel it was worth it?" Richard and Mrs. Susan exchanged glances before answering. "Emily," said Richard, "I spent 30 years wondering what if I had fought harder for your mother back then? What if I hadn't been so proud? What if I had been braver? And now? Now I know that all those experiences, good and bad, brought me to this moment, and this moment is worth all the years of waiting." "Mom?" asked Emily. "Honey, I was married to your father for 25 years. It was a good marriage, but there was always a feeling that something was missing. Now I know what it was." "What was it?" "The feeling of being completely known and accepted by someone. Your father loved me, but he never really knew me. Richard has known me for 30 years, knows all my flaws, and still chooses to love me every day." Emily said goodbye to them and went to her room with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Her family, which had started as a collection of distrust and secrets, had transformed into a circle of honesty and mutual acceptance. In her room, as she got ready for bed, Emily reflected on how her life had changed since Richard had appeared. She had learned about forgiveness, about second chances, about the difference between conditional love and genuine love. She had also learned about herself, that she was protective by nature, but that this protection could become excessive distrust if not balanced with openness to understanding people's motivations. Before sleeping, she wrote in her own diary, "Today I understood that family isn't about perfection. It's about being willing to be imperfect together with people who love you enough to accept you as you are, and who love you enough to challenge you to be better." The next morning, Emily woke up to the sound of Richard and her mother talking in the garden. She looked out the window and saw the two of them tending to the rose bushes while discussing their plans for the day. There was something about the scene that deeply reassured her. It wasn't drama or excessive passion. It was just two people who knew each other deeply, caring together for something they had planted with love. Emily got dressed and went down to join them for breakfast. When she arrived in the kitchen, she found the table set and Richard making scrambled eggs, while her mother made orange juice. "Good morning, family," she said. "Good morning, dear," they replied in unison. It was an ordinary morning for an ordinary family, but for three people who had gone through so much emotional complexity to get there, it was the most extraordinary morning in the world. During breakfast, Richard made an announcement. "Susan, Emily, I want to propose something to you." The two exchanged glances with a smile. They had already grown accustomed to Richard's proposals. "What is it this time?" asked Mrs. Susan, amused. "I want us to establish a family tradition." "What kind of tradition?" asked Emily. "Every Sunday I want us to gather here in the garden to write in our memory book. Each of us will record something important that happened during the week." "And if nothing important happens?" asked Mrs. Susan. "Then we'll write about the simple things that made us happy. The important thing is to keep a record of our life together." Emily liked the idea. "It's as if we're historians of our own family." "Exactly. And when we grow old and start forgetting things, we can read our own book to remember all the moments we lived together." Mrs. Susan was moved by the proposal. "Richard, you've always been romantic, but this idea is especially beautiful." "So it's settled. Every Sunday, family meeting to write in the book." "Settled," they both said. On that first Sunday of the new tradition, the three sat at the garden table in the late afternoon. Richard opened the book to the first blank page and passed it to Emily. "You can start." Emily thought for a moment and then began to write. "First entry of our new tradition. This week, I learned that trusting someone doesn't mean stopping questioning. It means questioning with love instead of questioning with fear." She passed the book to Mrs. Susan, who wrote, "This week I rediscovered what it's like to wake up next to someone who knows me completely and loves me anyway. It's a feeling I had forgotten existed." Finally, Richard took the book. "This week I understood that home is where you can be vulnerable without fear. It's where you can confess your worst mistakes and still find acceptance. It's where you can plant rose bushes knowing someone will water them when you can't." When they finished writing, they sat in silence, appreciating the garden they had cultivated together. The rose bushes were in full bloom, the grass was green, and there was a sense of peace hanging over everything. "So you know what makes me happiest," said Richard, breaking the silence. "What?" they both asked. "That we no longer need to pretend to be different people to be accepted. We can be exactly who we are, with our flaws and qualities, and still have a family that loves us." "It's true," agreed Mrs. Susan. "I spent so many years trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, that I forgot how relaxing it is to simply be myself. And I spent so many years trying to protect everyone that I forgot how good it is to have someone who also protects me," said Emily. Richard closed the book and put it back in the protective box. "So, our first family tradition was a success." "Definitely," they both agreed. As the sun set and they prepared to go inside, each knew they had found something rare and precious, a family built on honesty, forgiveness, and genuine love. For Emily, who had started this journey distrusting Richard, it was almost surreal how things had developed. The man she had suspected of being a criminal had turned out to be exactly what her mother needed. Someone who loved her enough to care for her in difficult times, but who also respected her enough to be honest about his own flaws. For Mrs. Susan, who had spent a whole year of mourning feeling lost and alone, it was wonderful to rediscover not only romantic love, but also the feeling of belonging to a close-knit family. For Richard, who had carried guilt and regret for years, it was liberating to finally have a place where he could be honest about his past, without fear of judgment, where he could love and be loved without pretenses. When they entered the house that night, Richard stopped at the door and looked one last time at the garden. "What are you thinking about?" asked Mrs. Susan. "I'm thinking it took me 30 years to learn that true love isn't about deserving someone. It's about choosing someone every day, even when it's hard." "And what else have you learned?" asked Emily. "I've learned that sometimes the greatest courage isn't facing external dangers, but facing the truth about ourselves, and that sometimes the greatest strength isn't being able to handle everything alone, but being able to accept help from those who love us." "Those are beautiful lessons," said Mrs. Susan. "But the most important one of all," Richard continued, "is that it's never too late to start over. No matter how many mistakes you've made, no matter how much time you've lost, there's always a chance to build something new and better." End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this touching story of love, forgiveness, and second chances. Do you believe Richard made the right decisions by taking responsibility for his past mistakes? And Emily, did she do the right thing by investigating his intentions before fully trusting him? Leave your honest opinion in the comments. We love reading what our listeners think. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.